Okay, looks like this is a one-on-one with Tree Care LA, and I don't know if that means Los Angeles or something else. So as Zach said, we're going to talk about, I think it said plant establishment, but we at Arborjet are tree people, so it's going to be focused mostly on trees, but a lot of carryover would apply to just about, yes, Los Angeles, that's good to know. We'll carry over to most plants. So if everybody's with me, we're going to go ahead and start. I like this quote from Dr. Ed Gilman of University of Florida. I highly recommend you use his resources on his website for all things tree. But this particular quote says, planting and establishing trees is about managing air and moisture in the soil. Manage these correctly, and trees will grow quickly following planting. But 3 of the most common causes of poor plant establishment or flat-out death are planting too deep, underwatering, and overwatering. If appropriate trees, and I probably should have highlighted appropriate trees, are planted at the right depth, they are irrigated properly, the planting has a good chance of success. As simple as that all sounds, problems often arise and lead to poor establishment or plant failure. So those highlighted areas plus appropriate trees, if I had highlighted that, are pretty much our roadmap for this half hour to 40 minutes. And we're going to start with tree selection, and I kind of added this ad-lib in late last night that if you fail here at the tree selection portion, the rest of what I'm going to say afterwards is almost irrelevant because it's like pushing a rock uphill. So picking the right tree, and there'll be a number of criteria which makes it the right tree, means that you're going to have a higher survival post-planting that tree. That tree is going to have longer, greater longevity in the landscape, and we're talking about establishment today, so less time needed for establishment when you've made the right choices. And then if you don't already have this bumper sticker from the Arbor Day Foundation, right tree, right place, they pound that home in every training. Can never forget about the soil. I'm pretty sure we've had a webinar just about soil in and of itself. And then proper planting, which everyone thinks they know, and believe it or not, those things have changed over the last years. And then watering criteria, which is not so much as a guess, like we kind of think it is. So with that, let's start with tree selection, which is probably more than half of what I'm going to talk about today. So first, you got to know why you're planting the tree. What purpose is it going to serve for its intended home? Are we looking for flowers? Are we looking for this to be a shade tree? Are we trying to screen out something? Do we need a barrier between you and the neighbor, or you and a light pole, or are we looking for a windbreak? Because we want a windbreak, then we're obviously going to be looking at something like an evergreen tree versus a deciduous tree. Is your goal energy conservation? So, farmers always planted windbreaks for that cold wind in the winter, and the shade tree for the shade over their house, because back then they didn't have air conditioning. And if you're thinking about commercial plantings, everyone knows that pavement lasts longer in the shade than in the complete blazing sun. If your goal is for fruit or nuts, great. But if that's not your goal, I wouldn't pick a tree that had messy fruit because it's just going to be a nuisance tree or a dirty tree for you. 2 in my area that I get calls on constantly are sweet gum trees and those little porcupine balls, and ginkgos that have reverted back to female and have the most obnoxious smelling fruit on God's green earth. Then knowing, is this species appropriate for your area? And not just hardiness zones, which you see as next, but is this species invasive? Here in Cincinnati, Ohio, where I'm located, Bradford pears or anything in that nasty little pear family has become an invasive species here. They weren't supposed to cross-pollinate, but they have, and now all of our expressways are just covered with them. So if it's an invasive plant, it's not a sustainable choice. One that's a perennial and not a tree in Michigan is Lythrum. I loved that plant when I was in landscape design, but in the wetlands, that will kind of take over like a reed grass. So they've kind of banned selling it even in states where it doesn't have those conditions. So if I can find it, I buy it. But for the most part, they'll take those very invasive plants off the market. If you're already in this industry, you know everything about hardiness zones and where you are, and usually no one's selling plants outside of that. But be aware of your microclimate, or if you have any, and probably out there you do. I know we have them here by the lake. That would be that small area within your region that had a different climate from all of the surrounding area. So we have that lakefront microclimate up near Cleveland, Ohio, that will be a lot cooler. Down here in the city of Cincinnati, the Cincinnati Zoo and Botanical Gardens has a microclimate that they tell us is a good 5 to 7 degrees warmer every single day than the neighborhood around it. So just always kind of be aware if you are choosing this plant for an area that has such a microclimate. Then, of course, plant source. Where are you getting it? If you guys are professionals, I know you're getting it from a qualified nursery, but if you're shopping at big box stores, you're going to get what you pay for. Yeah, it might be cheaper there, but it's also had a pretty rough life before you got to it. It's been out on asphalt half the summer before you got to it, being cared for by teenagers who are there as seasonal workers. And you might see species there that you've never seen before, and if it dies, even though there's a warranty on it, they're not going to see the same plant next year. And then a little deeper than the plant source on like what the supplier does it come from is what is the provenance of that plant, and that's going to go back to even deeper than your nurseries. Joe Boggs from Ohio State University talks about this a lot. Provenance is where the seed stock originated. So it's not just that we're in the same zone here in Cincinnati as they are in Colorado. Why do Colorado blue spruce do so much better there than here? Because here they pretty much die within a couple of years or get a disease. You know, it's very possible they're not from the same provenance and that we're not dealing with the same seed stock. And we're also not dealing with the same soil conditions as they are out there. Other things that you will consider when you're looking at specifically trees, but this could also be shrubs or any woody plant, is good branch spacing. Trunk taper from the bottom to the top. Root flare, I should have said root flare, root flare, root flare, like location, 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 because that's going to become very important to tree selection. Foliage evenly distributed in the upper 2/3 of your canopy, so not a one-sided plant. And avoid upright branches. So, you know, with the exception if that's what the species does, say like a Zelkova tree or any other vase-shaped tree, those are not strong unions. So if that's not the normal branching structure for that species, pass on trees that have too many upright branches. And I can't say this enough, single trunks, if it is a single trunk tree, with a strong leader. And that's a single strong leader, not multiple leaders. And then look for damage. Just because it's a new plant to you doesn't mean it hasn't been trucked and dropped and scratched. And, you know, they even have a scratch and dent area nursery, so I wouldn't shop there. Pass on that. Here's a couple examples. The far left with the pink arrow, you're seeing this species has included bark, so that's going to constantly, A, it's a weak union, and B, there's not going to be any translocation in that bark if it were higher, even all the way to the ground. It's just going to be future problems for you. And then the other two are examples of multiple leaders. The center one is on a hardwood tree, and then the far right is your evergreen. The evergreen looks young enough to still be corrected. You could correct this center one, but I wouldn't. This should have been done when this tree was a lot smaller. To correct it now would just be years and years of waiting for this tree to look good. So I would pass on that one as well. Look for these cankers like in the top left picture. This is obviously a sign of disease where it could have entered or will enter. The bottom left is some kind of wound that could have been just scraped on the truck. Don't think it was animal, but you never know. Will it heal? Maybe. Why would you buy it? I wouldn't. The far right, this tree is obviously established. There's the building in the background, but it was just in the same structure when it was purchased. It had no central leader. It's a codominant stem that already makes it a weak tree and a poor choice. So you would pass on that. I said we would talk about root flare, and Ed Gilman at the University of Florida will talk about this extensively on his website. You always want to look for this, whether it's a container or whether it's a B&B tree. Now, you're not going to see it until you take the burlap off of those trees, but you definitely, when we get to planting, we'll talk more about being able to locate that root flare, whether it's a root ball or a container. Here's an example of two B&B trees after they've been unwrapped. That these look like 2-inch caliper trees were anywhere from an 8 to, I think the bottom one says 10 inches buried deep in the ball. So if you didn't excavate and get down to that root flare and just stuck this ball in the ground, you're already 10 inches planting too deep. And then if you just plant too deep, you could literally have this in the ground 1.5 to 2 feet too deep, just depending on how careless the planting was. And then, the long-term ramifications of that could be just this tree that breaks off in a storm. Native plants, right? It's the season, well, except for in California, there is no winter, but in Ohio and the Midwest, we always go to winter seminars, and they're always pushing native plants, native plants, native plants. Okay, great. But native plants do not guarantee sustainability and necessarily make them resistant to insects or diseases, because, we have lots of examples of that. But more importantly, native plants aren't native to the urban environment, and that's primarily where most of us are planting. No one's going out and creating a forest for a client. So native is great, but it's not necessarily the best choice for every condition. So depending on the challenge of where you need to put plant or plants, there actually might be non-native trees or plants that are better suited for the poor growing conditions. So if it's a high salt environment or very dry and arid, there might be something that's non-native that would be better. So yes, it's a good thing, but it's not the be-all, end-all. Another concept I don't think we talk about enough is a monotypic selection. What that means is that if you would choose plants that have fewer species within the genus, you're just going to have fewer problems. The example I gave here is the Kentucky coffee tree. That has one species. It literally has no pest. The flip side of that would be maple trees. They have at least 125 species and over 200 pests. And it hasn't reached the West Coast yet, but here in the Midwest and on the East Coast, we've had the Asian longhorn beetle, which takes about 10 years to totally eradicate. And we have to, because it has 13 different species on its grocery list of eating, and maples are #1. So food for thought is that species diversity is not as important as genus diversity. So pests attack a genus, not just the species. We have learned from, Dutch elm disease and emerald ash borer, the planting rule of 5, 10, 15. So no more than 5% of trees should be from the same species, and no more than 10% from the same genus, but no more than 15% from the same family. So if you keep that in mind, and then find those genus with fewer species. Those are going to be good problem-free plants for you. Maples would not be in it, and there are more trees out there than maples. We've just been going to that one over and over again. Consider your plant at mature size above and below ground. I think a lot of times we forget about the below ground part, and people tend to think, I'll just keep this pruned to be this cute little tree right next to the house, but it just never happens. So then it really doesn't become sustainable because it's a nightmare, and eventually it's going to outgrow, or it's going to get damaged, or it's going to be removed. So that's not sustainable. You want to think about the moisture requirements and the sun requirements for your species. Larger canopy trees obviously prefer full sun, which is great because we want them to provide full shade. And your understory and smaller canopy trees want at least a partial day of shade. So know the maintenance requirements before installation. If you or your customer is not willing to do what it takes, say if that does have fruit that needs cleaned up, or they're just not a big leaf raker, make the choices based on that. Lindsay Purcell, Purdue University, he says successful trees selection requires us to think backwards. So beginning with the end in mind, to get the right tree in the right place in the right way. So right now we're talking about getting the right tree, and we're going to move on to putting it in the right place, and we're going to end up with putting it in the right way. So in the right place, soil conditions. And like I said previously, there's another webinar, it's probably recorded on our website, all about soil. Here we talk about pH a lot. If you go to a doctor, they wouldn't just throw medicine at you without doing a blood test. We probably shouldn't be throwing plants in the ground without doing at least a soil pH test. Some people even do the pH test on the water that it's going to be irrigated with, because that can change things. So pH can be the indicator of nutrient availability. So if it's off and you need nitrogen or manganese or boron and it's fixed, then your tree is going to be chlorotic. Most trees prefer slightly acidic soils, but don't guess. You don't know what's happened to the soil before you got there. Test it. It's cheap and well worth its money. In addition, know the type. Know the type of soil and choose a compatible tree. If it's a heavy soil, most plants don't like wet feet, but there are some that do better than others. If you have a sandy soil, know that what your irrigation is going to be, but choose carefully on those sandy soils because they're going to be dry. And then check for drainage. So the quick test on that, if you've never done it, is dig your planting hole, fill it halfway up with water, time yourself for 2 hours. If that planting hole is empty, that is a well-drained soil and good to proceed in that area. And now we're moving on to the right place, or kind of continuing, because the soil would indicate that as well. Far left, one of my clients in Cleveland, Ohio sent. I love what they did to the tree because, gosh, the house got in the way. But we see this all the time, right? If it's not a house, it's a fence, it's a bicycle, it's something. But a good rule of thumb, plant your trees at least 20 feet away from the house, and larger trees may need to be as far as 40 feet from the house. And I know that looks weird initially, but down the road, at least they will grow together nicely instead of end up like one of these three victims. Also be thinking about what that tree is going to do in terms of a sight line. Is it going to, when you back out of your driveway, are you not going to be able to see around it? Is it going to block a sidewalk? Big for your stop signs. I love it when you can't see the stop sign, right? And overhead and, again, the underground utilities. So you should all be calling ahead anyhow before you dig. But, I mean, we've had a lot of tree topping in life just because we put big trees under short power lines, and better choices could have been made. All right. So now we've picked our tree. We followed all those, rules, and We know where it's going to go, and we're going to follow these suggested. I've compared a couple. I went with Ed Gilman's 10 steps. You can see those on his website. These are very similar to that. Purdue University has a good set as well. But this advice has not changed. Dig shallow and wide planting hole. How wide has changed. I think we used to say back in the day 2 to 3 times the size of the root ball. We don't say that anymore because if you can imagine a spaded tree being, say, 3 foot in diameter, that could be about a 9-foot diameter crater. So we don't say that anymore. But you're going to measure the distance between the top root, that one that we're going to find if it's not visible on the top of your container or B&B, to the bottom of the ball. So you take that measurement. You're going to dig your hole slightly shallower than that measurement, and no more than 2 or 3 inches of that plant is going to stick up above the final grade. Unless you're in an area and you've done that water test and you have to put this tree there and it is poorly drained, you're going to plant higher. So we're not going 2 to 3 times the diameter. Or the recommendation currently is to make that hole at least 1.5 times the diameter of the root ball. Obviously, there's greater privilege to do that with smaller container trees. It's just easier, but once these plants get bigger, you're not going to be doing those 9-foot craters. But if it is a very compacted soil, the more of that you can break up around the tree, the better. And after you've done all that work to get through the tree selection, this is not where you want to cut corners. So better to put a 50-cent tree in a $5 hole than a $5 hole, or a $5 tree in a 50-cent hole. Step 3 is finding that root. If you haven't already found it, you're going to remove as much dirt as possible. It's there, so just keep looking. I've seen things planted as much as 10 to 12 inches too deep in the ball, which means that once you've taken that off, you really don't have a lot of roots with that. So I would kind of try to discover that at the nursery, because if you've taken off 10 inches off the top, what you have is a very shallow root ball, which means not very many roots at all. You're going to check for defects at this point. So if you see a girdling root or you see things that you can cut or spread out, you want to do that before you actually put this guy in the ground. Here's some examples of circling roots in a container plant on your top left. The bottom left will show a correction with the saw. I think the top right is from an ISA Best Management Practices. They recommend going in, scoring the ball or the container 1 inch deep and across the bottom, because they tend to circle across the bottom as well. Larger plants, maybe like your bottom right, you may have done that with a spade, backwards, a sharp spade, and just scored off the sides. So I know people have a lot of fear about damaging that part, but you're really doing yourself, your clients, and the plant a favor by getting that ready in this fashion before you go in the hole. This is the time to correct the roots, not after you've backfilled it. So now we're ready to put your tree or your plant in its hole that you've perfectly measured and dug, and you've already corrected any root problems. Just don't lift these things by the trunk. I know that's easier, than to bend our knees and lift things from the bottom, but that's what you need to do for container plants. And if your root balls are too heavy, be using a cart or roll them in the hole. And if you're using containerized plants, just keep in mind those might settle 1 inch or 2 more than a B&B tree, because they're lighter soilless mix. So be cognizant of that and plant them a little higher. So you're going to position that topmost root, which you probably had to uncover, in the hole 1 to 3 inches above your final soil line. So plant even higher, like we said, if it's a poorly drained soil. But if you put that in the ground and it's too deep, please take it out. And if it's a B&B, I get that it's very hard to get out, so you can do the tip back and forth method, right? Because now you've dropped this big heavy tree in the hole. Tip it to one side, pack some dirt under that, tip it back. You're going to do that on all 4 sides. You'll be able to push enough under there with your feet to actually raise that up 1 inch or so. but don't say, wow, it's too heavy, I'm not going to get it out, and I'm just going to try to go with it as it is, because in the long run, that's not going to pay off for you. So once you got it where you need it, you're going to place a little bit around the ball or the container just to stabilize it so it doesn't tip over. The current thinking is that soil amendments are not necessary. They don't really help in this situation. I know a lot of marketing will say that they do. And the soil removed from the hole is the best backfill. So bringing in a foreign soil or some other kind of amended soil or something lighter that actually doesn't even blend with the current soil is a bad thing. Going with the native soil is always the best. The sixth step is to straighten that in the hole. It's kind of nice when there's two of you there, and if it's a big tree, there will be. So you're going to view that from two different directions. You want to know that it's not leaning one direction or the other, so that's not left to right or front to back. And if it is, you're just going to step in the soil and straighten it out. And then once that is perfectly in there and stable, we're going to move on to step 7, which is removing all synthetic materials. So that's your tags and your string and your rope and synthetic burlap, which is the picture to the right. That tree was excavated after 10 years of being in the ground, and that burlap is still there. Now that's synthetic burlap. Don't see a lot of that in the United States, but just beware that you don't really know all the time where the plant source is. Treated burlap seems to be okay, but again, you should have at least unpinned that to search for that top root flare and tuck that down, or I tend to cut mine at least halfway or 2/3 down. I just don't want it in the hole. I want as much, I don't want that to have the water run off, because it tends to wick the water away from the plant, and I just don't want it to, wait on the breakdown. Why not take it off when you're there? I will kind of say that if this is a big tree, when we get to step 10, the last thing is going to be to prune it. If this is a big tree and you can't reach it once it's in the hole, before we have put this in the hole, that's when you would want to do that, while it's still laying on the ground. So now it's in the hole, it's perfect. You've taken all the plastic and rope and metal and all of that off. We're going to add the backfill, the same dirt we took out of the hole, and we're going to firm that into the hole. So I like a flat spade. Slice that shovel back and forth about 20 to 30 times. The bigger the hole, you don't want those big clumps in there, because that's going to create a lot of air pockets for you. Don't pack it, just firmly step it to stabilize the tree. Some people say you need to get the air pockets out of there. Dr. Gilman says, they're not such a bad thing, and the water will take care of that over time anyhow. The root ball should still be up 1 to 3 inches above your backfilled soil, and then you're going to get ready to water it up to 20 gallons directly to the root ball, not an oscillating sprinkler to the entire area, just to that specific planting, or if it's in a bed, to the entire bed. And then you're going to mulch. And if you notice this picture at the far bottom right here, that's a pretty big mulch ring by most standards. And if you can get away with that with your customers, that's of course what's best for the tree. You're going to want 3 inches of mulch around the tree, so to the drip line, more if you can get it, because let's face it, the drip line's only going to get bigger. And you want none or very thin, maximum of 1 inch over the actual container or root ball itself. So the rule of thumb is 2 to 3 foot diameter of a mulch ring per inch of caliper tree. So as you can see, it should be, as the tree gets bigger, so does the mulch ring. You may have already read about creating that little berm. You see that in the bottom left picture, to hold the water in so that it doesn't run off. So that would be if you had a pretty fast irrigating method that you had to keep it there, or maybe it's planted on a slope. If you feel that you need to do that, make that berm out of your mulch and not your soil, And it's not there forever. It's just until that plant is established, and yes, that could be a couple of years. And then you're not stepping it in. You're really just kind of spreading it out, because anytime you're starting to step things in at that point, you're at risk of compaction. Then we've finished all of that, and now we're down to the to stake or not to stake, and pruning. So no, the whole prune off 1/3 or 2/3 or any thirds that we used to read about, that is not the current thinking. The only pruning you do at this point, if it's not a single leader, but you chose a good tree, so we went through tree selection, you did choose that, so you shouldn't have to do that. But if something is broken, or you just want to prune off some of the temporary branches, and all the low branches are temporary on a tree. Stake it if you need to hold the root ball firmly in the soil. So those stakes would be in the ground and permanent. You're never going to dig them up. The bigger the tree is, they shouldn't need to be staked. But if they are staked and you don't want to fall victim of this picture here, you're going to remove those after 1 year or one growing season. And again, if this is a tree that's of size that you don't think that you could prune it standing up in the hole, because remember it's going to be about 2 foot shorter once you put it in the ground, then do that while it's still laying down before you stand it up. Now is the maintenance, because it's the most critical part of establishment. Either underwatering or overwatering is the #1 killer of a tree. And we all sell things. None of us sell water. I wish we did, because it's kind of the life or death of a lot of things. But during establishment period, you're going to water 2 to 3 times a week with 1 to 1.5 gallons per inch trunk caliper. So that's not DBH, and I deal mostly with DBH in what I do. So if you don't deal with caliper, there's a short definition there, 6 inches above the ground, up to a 4 inch. And then if it's greater than that, you're going to measure it at 4 or 12 inches above the ground. All that water, and that's the 1 to 1.5 is normal. I've seen higher, but it tends to be, and may be higher, say in California and Florida. I've seen it as much as 2 gallons per inch of trunk caliper. But know this, frequency has greater effect than volume. It's the same way with turf. You can't make up for missed watering by adding more. So if you're supposed to do it 2 to 3 times a week and you did it once, and you think you'll just make up for it by adding more water that when you get back, it's not really, might help your conscience, it's just not going to help the tree. And then here's kind of a good example of how much water and for how long, and by how long I mean for tree establishment. About a 2-inch caliper tree takes 3 to 4 years to actually establish. And establishment is defined as that tree surviving where you planted it without supplemental water. So that's not going to be in a season. And the bigger it is, the longer it's going to take. I think we lean to that we found that the sweet spot are the 2-inch caliper trees. They tend to establish faster. And there have been studies where they planted a 2-inch and a 4-inch tree on the same genus species location as part of a study. The 2-inch catches up and exceeds the growth rate of the 4-inch. So bigger in this case is not always better unless it's just what you have to have for the site, because the landscape architect has spec'd it that way. But in terms of the long-term survival and establishment of the plant, that 2-inch seems to be the sweet spot. So on the green table to the left, you see less than a 2-inch caliper. You're watering it now. You have choices. Do you just want it to survive, or you're really trying to do something with this tree? If you really are wanting to do something and want a lot of vigor out of this tree, you're going to have it watered every day for 2 weeks. And then after 2 weeks, every other day for 2 months. And after 2 months, weekly until established, which, if you go to the table on the right, what is the term of establishment? Second one down is a 2-inch caliper. root establishment time for trees in years. So 2-inch is 3 years. And the total water volume is to the right, and then that does add up to the 1 to 1.5 per inch of caliper we talked about prior. And under 2 inches, 1 inch. So 1.5 to 3 years for probably 90% of the stock that we plant to actually be established if it was actually watered under the table to the left. And I think that's generous at best. Because, you know, once we leave the site, we can never guarantee. And, of course, this does not include any kind of rainfall. And I always advise people to water as if it didn't rain, because people always think there was enough rain, and there hardly ever is. All right. That is 38 minutes, and I apologize for the overages because I know you have work to do. If there are any questions, I think you put them in the bubble now, or if you think of them later, my contact information is on the Arborjet website. My name is Dawn, D-A-W-N Sherman. I'm in the Midwest, or for you folks out in Los Angeles, there is another Dawn Fluharty on our website. If you have questions specifically in your area, I would contact her, because the species you guys have out there would be foreign to me. You're welcome, Francis. And Karina? No problem. Dawn F is great to us. That is good to hear. I'll tell her you said so. Thanks, guys. Back to work.
For anyone that needs the ISA CEU number, hold on a moment. I'm going to put it in that little talk box for anybody.
See, there's Zach always thinking. I already forgot that piece. I was already back to work.
There you go. For any of you that attended, it is PP-18-158. And we did record this.